Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. Jesus said to his disciples, "I have come to set the earth on fire, and how I wish it were already blazing. There is a baptism with which I must be baptized, and how great is my anguish until it is accomplished. Do you think that I have come to establish peace on the earth? No, I tell you, but rather division. From now on, a household of 5 will be divided, 3 against 2, and 2 against 3. A father will be divided against his son, and a son against his father. A mother against her daughter, and a daughter against her mother. A mother-in-law against her daughter-in-law, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
Some people say that things happen in threes. And it seems, as I was reflecting on these readings, that this is the third time in the last couple of weeks that God is definitely reminding me of things that are essential to being a good priest, and yet still outside of my comfort zone. Some of you may remember that I alluded to a homily a couple of weeks ago, my inherent fear of public speaking, which is something that all priests do, and yet every time I get up here, I am always nervous. The second fear was during a daily homily, so most of us probably, I had to think about it for some time. The fear that I have of asking for money. I do not like asking people for money. Today is the third sort of fear, presented especially in the Gospel. The fear of challenging people. I don't like it. And yet, these readings are challenging. The first reading, and especially the Gospel, they are hard to digest. And yet, we believers, including clergy, including priests, deacons, and bishops, we shy away from their sharpness at our own peril. Christ is a source of division. This is inescapable, but it's not simply something that is ethereal and remote and abstract. This is something that all of us experience right now in our families. As our society becomes less Christian, and it will probably continue to be such, as it becomes less influenced by Christian ideas and by the faith, those of us who choose to continue to be Catholic must make that a conscious choice. We're not here because of a familial decision or because of a cultural decision. We choose to be Catholic because it is something that arises from within us. It comes from a place of prayer, from a place of reflection, which means to be Catholic means to live differently. And sometimes these differences include those who live among us, those who are closest to us, those whom we love. And those differences of ways of life can be stark, and are often stark. And as a result of this division, and because we love our relatives, hopefully, these divisions are painful. I don't know of a family, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't know of a family that does not currently experience Christ as a source of division. That there are not people in our families, whether they're immediate, say our parents or our children, or our extended relatives, our aunts, our uncles, cousins, other relatives, that have Christ as a sort of dividing line. Those who still come to Mass and those who no longer or have converted or have left the faith altogether. So a natural sort of question that hopefully we can ask ourselves, how do we square these two things of Christ? Right? Because we have the difficult readings of Christ that we heard in the Gospel. I have not come to bring peace but division. How do we make sense of this in light of what we usually hear, especially at Christmas time, right? Christ is the Prince of Peace. He has come to inaugurate a time of peace, a time of spiritual prosperity. The answer to this question, how do we reconcile these two aspects of God, these two aspects of Christ, lie in another question. How do we receive God's love What does God's love look like in a world that's gone wrong? The first place, what is axiomatic, if you will, of our faith, is that God is love. God is not like love. Love is not a nice image or an analogy for God. God, in his very essence, is love, period. We perceive God's love as part of a fallen, as part of a broken world. The scriptural word that is often used is sin. Sin indicates brokenness, something going wrong. This is the context in which we receive and encounter God's love. And it's not just in the people around us, it's not just in society and the societal era that we live and breathe. This includes our own selves. We are broken. We, in a word, are sinful. This includes our own mind and our own heart. This is the context in which we receive God's love. My Dominican brother, the great St. Thomas Aquinas, adapted a phrase, and I've quoted it before, but he adapted a phrase from Aristotle. Hopefully students of philosophy will recognize it. Quid recipitur, ad modum recipientis recipitur. And because most of us, including myself, do not speak Latin, an English translation of this wise phrase goes like this. That which is received according to the mode of the receiver. What does this mean? For example, maybe some of you are like myself. I am not a morning person. God in his generosity spared me from being assigned to a parish, and instead my first assignment is here at a college campus ministry, which means practically I don't have to get up for early morning mass. Praise be God. I am not a morning person. And yet, if I was at a parish, I would probably have to wake up in time for 6 a.m. or 7 a.m. Mass, or 7 a.m. Mass on Sunday. When I go back to visit my family, that's the family Mass that we go to, and my family is all, okay, let's get ready to go, and I'm trying to drag myself out the door. If you're like myself, and you're not a morning person, who are the worst people to be around? Morning people. Because we're trying to get our minds straight on and not put a toothpick or something else in our mouth to brush our teeth, but instead our toothbrush. People who are friendly, who are smiling, who are, dare to say, talkative, are the most obnoxious to be around. Because I am not a morning person. Another example. Think back, UD alums, to that first book that we read in Philosophy and the Ethical Life. Plato's Republic. One of the most frequently recalled images from that book is the analogy of the cave. A person who has spent their whole life looking at dim images reflected on a cave wall through the dimness of a fire. As they make their way out of the cave, what is the most obnoxious or painful thing that they come across? The sun. The brilliant light of the sun is painful to their eyes, because they have not experienced the radiant light of the sun up until that point. The light's not doing anything special to hurt the eyes of that person. It's just doing what light naturally does. It shines everywhere. And yet, because that person's eyes is not used to seeing the radiance of the sun, it is experienced as painful, as undesirable even. This is how we receive God's love. Because we are broken, because we are so mired in sin and so easily inclined to sin, right? As much as we try to be honest, to try to be true, to try to be courageous, I can say in my own life, I often fail to live the faith that we profess here each and every Sunday. This is why often in our lives we can perceive God's love as judgmental, as cruel, as piercing, sharper than a two-edged sword, because we receive God's love as creatures that are broken in a broken world. If we're in a good spiritual place, we will perceive God's love as something beautiful, kind, pleasant even. But if we cling to sin in our hearts, if sin is something that has taken a deep root in our minds and in our lives, if we are mired in sin, and if our spiritual or moral lives are off kilter, we will experience God's love like we heard in the gospel as a piercing, burning, judging fire. Christ breaks up our false sense of peace with the fervor of a consuming fire, and it hurts. And it's important to remember that God is love. He does not enjoy causing us to suffer, and indeed He does not immediately cause us to suffer. This fire that Christ desires to alight in our world and in our lives is meant to burn away everything that keeps us from Him. All the impurities, if you will, like impurities that attach to precious gems or to gold, just like they must be burned away so that the beautiful radiance of that metal shines forth, so too it is with our own lives. One of the things that I learned when I was a Boy Scout is that fire, contrary to my perhaps immediate inclination, fire in a forest is not always a bad thing. Because the underbrush of the forest can become so overgrown with moss, so overgrown with plants and weeds and other forms of vegetative creatures, that it becomes so overrun that the sun cannot even pierce the floor of the forest. And so, natural occurrence is a forest fire that burns away all of the things that are keeping the rain from hitting the soil, the sun from touching the soil. And as a result of sometimes that great destruction, new life is able to spring forth. Rain and sun are able to pierce where they were not able to touch before. Is that what we're left with? Is that all? A sort of burning fire, this division within ourselves, this division within our families. Maybe you noticed Christ's words were a bit odd. In addition to their sharpness, right, we perhaps all immediately picked up on that. But Christ was very specific in His example. He didn't just say families will be divided. He was very specific about His language. Some Scripture scholars will note that when Christ is oddly specific with His language, it's because He wants us to think back to the Old Testament. What He has in mind is something that we may not immediately think of. And so He did. He had in mind, unfortunately, not the first reading from the prophet Jeremiah, but from another prophet, from the prophet Micah. For the son treats the father with contempt. The daughter rises up against her mother. The daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. A man's enemies are the men of his own house. Christ was almost quoting verbatim the prophet Micah. The central action, if you will, the summary of the book of the prophet Micah, is that God will bring reunification. He will gather to Himself all the lost tribes of Israel and inaugurate an era of peace and of unity. But this time of peace and tranquility doesn't come automatically. What precedes it is this time of division. And it's a division that cuts so deep that it affects the most sacred of unities, that of the family. Christ says that time is now. I am the one who is inaugurating, yes, this era of peace and this era of reunification. But what comes before that is division. What comes before that is strife. So lest we become filled with a sense of despair when we look at our families or the world around us, or even the division in our own lives and hearts, that division is a sign of hope in the same way that the cross is a sign of hope. Just like the cross leads to the empty tomb and Calvary leads to the resurrection, so the division that we experience in our own families is meant to be a sign of hope. Without the cross, there is no empty tomb. Without the suffering, there is no redemption. So what can we do? Well, we can trust God. We can allow God to do what He says He is going to do. That He does not wish to hurt us for hurting us' sake, but that He wishes to burn away all that keeps us from Him. We must acknowledge that there are in fact divisions. It would be foolish and foolhardy to wish away the divisions that do exist in our families. Yes, of course, to note the areas in which we agree, but not to fool ourselves into thinking that there is peace where there is not. But I'd say above all, and perhaps most dangerous, that we have an inclination to when we recognize these divisions, is to avoid bitterness. When we recognize that we are indeed separated from members of our families that we love, to not let our hearts be hardened, to not become bitter and perceive them to be the problem. as we come forward to receive the gift of Christ's body and his blood, may we allow Christ to burn away everything that keeps us from him and refuse to give in to bitterness and always be possessed by his peace.